Hey Defenders, welcome back. In this video, I want to show you guys how to monitor your SIEM stack with one of our favorite monitoring tools, InfluxDB. Now, what do we mean exactly by monitoring your SIEM stack? We also need to make sure that the servers that are running these applications and tools are also optimized when it comes to system resources. And by that, I mean CPU consumption, memory usage, disk space, and critical processes such as the Wazoo indexer service, the Wazoo manager service, the Graylog service, etc. We also need a mechanism that can monitor on those critical system resources and processes, because without any of these operating at their full capacity, we could run the risk of missing logs that we're attempting to ingest into the SIEM stack. We can start to hit bottlenecks when it comes to running our search queries within Grafana, for example. So Grafana dashboards start to load slowly. And we need a mechanism that can monitor those resources and also alert us when particular thresholds have been met, and InfluxDB is the perfect tool to do that. So in this video, we're going to install the InfluxDB service and then also deploy a Telegraf agent, which is actually the process that runs on the servers that we're monitoring to collect those system resources and sends those to our InfluxDB server. So let's go ahead and actually jump into that. So on my VM here, I'm just going to use this same VM to not only deploy the InfluxDB server, but I'm also going to deploy the Telegraf agent onto the server to monitor these system resources. So let's go ahead and first start with installing InfluxDB. So I'm just going to copy and paste the commands that we have here within the repository. Run an app get update, and then followed by an app get install for InfluxDB2. And then with InfluxDB installed, I'm going to go ahead and start the service. Let me just run a quick status of it to make sure that InfluxDB is up and running. Looks like it is. And then I'm going to go ahead and enable the service. So when this server reboots, the InfluxDB service will restart at boot time. And then InfluxDB is going to be listening on port 8086. And here we can see our box is listening on that there. Let me just run a quick another status check, and looks like everything's good. So now that's all that needs to be done when it comes to first installing InfluxDB. But now we need to make some configuration settings within InfluxDB. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to my InfluxDB server. Here I'm just putting in the host name of the box that's running the service. Again, I'm using port 8086. By default, that is what InfluxDB runs on. And then having configured HTTPS, I'm just going to connect over HTTP. And then we will get our web UI of the InfluxDB administration console. So I'm going to go ahead and say get started. Here we need to first set up our initial user. So I'll just call it admin. I'll give it a password of please subscribe. Now I'm going to set an organization name. For this, I'm just going to say SOC Fortress. You can configure multiple organizations within InfluxDB if you choose. For a majority of you guys, you'll probably just need to configure one organization name. And of course, this can be whatever you want. And then we're going to configure a bucket name. We do need to remember these two settings that we set, because when configuring the Telegraf agent, we will need to know the organization name as well as the bucket name. And for the bucket name, I always like to keep it standard and just call it Telegraf, because we're using a Telegraf agent to send events to this bucket. But again, this can be any string of characters that you would like to use. I'll go ahead and select continue. I will go ahead and select advanced. It redirects us to the buckets page here. And then here we see the created bucket that we just set called Telegraf. The retention defaults to forever. I don't necessarily care about keeping these system metrics forever. Again, these metrics that are going to be collected are going to have to be written to disk on the InfluxDB server. So if I leave this at forever, I run the risk of my disk eventually becoming fully consumed with metrics, and meaning that there's no free space to where I can receive current and future logs. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust that. I'm going to select settings here. And then I'm just, there's a lot of custom durations you can set. I usually like to just say 7 days. So I keep only 1 week's worth of data at a time. So I go ahead and save those changes. And now if I open up the alerts, for example, you'll see there's nothing configured here. And if I look at the data explorer, of course, there's not going to be any data coming in because we don't actually have a Telegraf agent deployed. So let's go ahead and deploy that. Think of Influx as like your Wazoo manager and Telegraf as like your Wazoo agent. Telegraf is going to send metrics to the InfluxDB server, and then that's where we're actually going to be able to load the data, configure alerts, and actually monitor the stack. So I'll go ahead and open this guy back up. Let me get the Medium page back open, and let's now install the Telegraf agent. This is where I'd recommend deploying the agent to all of the servers that are actually making up your, Wazoo indexer cluster, your Wazoo manager cluster, your gray logs, etc., so that you can monitor the resources and services running on these servers. I'll throw these off to the side so it's a little easier. Clear that out, and I'll get started with installing Telegraf. And then I'm also going to provide a example Telegraf conf that you guys can use as well. Similarly, I'll run an apt-get update and apt-get install Telegraf. And I'll go ahead and throw this into my buffer here. All right, we got Telegraf installed. If I go into Etsy Telegraf and open up the telegraf.conf, you'll see that there's a big sample file. There's a lot of different configurations you can change. What I'm gonna do is just go ahead and blow all this away, and then I am going to input what the sample config I have on the Medium, and then we're going to make a few changes. So first we need to actually configure the output to the InfluxDB server. So here we're going to replace this guy with the host name or IP address of my InfluxDB server, which in my case is ashdev copilot .sockfortress.local. We now need to actually create a Telegraf token. So let's go back into the load data section here. And under API tokens, let's go ahead and generate a new API token. And then let's set this to custom access token. And then here, I'm just going to select the dropdown on the Telegrafs. And I'm going to say read and write permissions to the Telegrafs, resource. And I'm just going to go ahead and call this Telegraf. And then select generate. And then I'm going to copy this value here that it outputs. And I'm going to put this in as the token. Here is now where we need to set our organization in our bucket. We set our organization to Sock Fortress, and then our bucket we just named a Telegraf. And then all of these you can just leave as the default. So here we're essentially telling Telegraf what we want it to monitor. We want it to monitor the CPU. We want it to monitor the disk, memory, running processes. You can set additional settings for all of these, like additional settings for monitoring memory, or maybe I want to exclude monitoring certain processes. By setting this, it just defaults to hey, send me all of the processes that are running on this machine. So I'm going to go ahead and save this off. And now let's go ahead and start the Telegraf agent. So I'm going to run a systemctl start Telegraf, and then I'll have a log file under var log telegraf.log. And here we'll be able to see immediately if there's any errors. And it looks like seems like we're getting insufficient permissions to write. Let's see what's going on here. Let's go ahead and recreate a new Telegraf token. My bad. I need to change to the Telegraf bucket because that's actually the bucket that we're writing to. So let me go ahead and just call this guy Telegraf again. I don't need read permissions, so I'm just going to say write permissions because really we're just interested in this agent writing to this bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and select generate. Let me copy this new token that's been created. I'll open up the telegraf.conf. Then I'll just blow the old token away and paste this in here. And then go ahead and restart our Telegraf agent. And now let's go ahead and retail the log file, and let's see if we get better results here. Failures will start popping up pretty quickly, like we saw them pretty quickly just a second ago. So this appears to be looking good by default, but we'll know for sure once we actually see data start to come in. And sure enough, if I now go to the data explorer, if I select like CPU, Let me just select usage idle. How many CPU cores we could select if we want to monitor just a specific core on the box. But here I'll just monitor the total. And then here we see the actual host that we can actually monitor. So if I go ahead and submit this guy, now we see our graph start to populate of CPU usage. And if I change this, let me just make it a little more frequent so it's a little easier to see the graph. We can now see CPU metrics start to come in. And of course, this pertains to to usage that is idle. If we look at memory used, we can see how much memory has being used on the machine at this time. As you can see, there's a ton of metrics. There's a ton of different other metrics we can collect. I could look at running processes, I think, too. And there's a ton of other data that you can explore that I won't totally get into. But let's go ahead and actually configure an alert to monitor the CPU usage on this server. What I'm going to do is go ahead and select a threshold check, because this will allow us to set, okay, when CPU raises above, let's say, like 95% usage, for example, that's what I want to be my threshold. So if we're above that threshold, that is what I want to signal as an alert to the SOC team or infrastructure team or whomever, stating that, hey, CPU consumption is running actually pretty high on this particular server. Here, I'll first just name the check. I'll call it CPU check. Let me just say 95%. And then I'll select my Telegraf, because again, that's the bucket. This is always going to be Telegraf. Of course, you can have multiple buckets if you want, but in our instance, we're just using Telegraf. I'll go ahead and select CPU. And then I'm going to select the usage idle and then CPU total, because notice there's actually no like usage consumption here. So I'm actually just going to use the inverse, and that being usage idle, CPU title. Go ahead and select submit here. And now we can see that the CPU amount that is idle is around, 99%, meaning that this box still has adequate amount of CPU to allocate. If we look at resources, if we run htop here, look at processes and how much CPU they're consuming, we can see it's really not too much. So this box is really pretty idle. And that's exactly when it comes to CPU consumption, and that's exactly what is being rendered on our InfluxDB chart. So when it comes to us configuring our check, let's go ahead and we can schedule this for however frequently we want to run the check. I'll just leave it at a minute for now. Now here we can actually set a message template. So this is what will actually come in the alert if it were to trigger. And we can dynamically set these to variables. So I can say like the check name, which of course would render to the CPU check 95%, the level that we set the alert to. And then I can also dynamically populate on various fields that we can use to when it comes to actually building the alert criteria within the threshold check here. So if we go back to the Medium post, and I can just copy this guy here, and we can walk through kind of what this message will template out. This would first tell us, hey, that whatever threshold we're on, critical, warning, or info, which we'll set that here in a sec. That'll give us the level. And then the check name. So here, in this case, it would be CPU check 95%. The host that's actually triggering this alert, so we know what server it is that has the high CPU. And then we're going to subtract the usage idle from 100, since this is a percentage. So this will tell us how much CPU is currently being consumed on this host, and will give us a little more insight into the alert before we actually jump into InfluxDB and investigate it further. So now let's go ahead and actually set our threshold. So let's go ahead and set a critical. And since we're looking at usage idle, I'm actually going to say below, and here I'm going to say 5%. So that meaning that if CPU usage idle is below 5%, that means 95 or more percent is actually being consumed by the server. And some process on the server is consuming all of this CPU, which we would be able to see digging deeper into the dashboards and metrics that InfluxDB is collecting. So if we look at our chart too, once we do change that threshold, it gives us the little line here so we can indicate where on the graph our threshold needs to meet in order for this alert to trigger. And then here we see that currently, the CPU is really idle because there's really not much of anything going on. I think Grafana's running and Copilot's running on this. So it's not doing too much computational work on it that would be consuming a lot of CPU resources. So I'll go ahead and save this guy. And then we now have our CPU check to monitor for 95%. We can do something similar for checking memory consumption as well. So I'll go ahead and create a new threshold check. Let me just call this memory check. Of course, these names can be whatever you want. For my measurement, since we want to be monitoring memory, I'll go ahead and select memory. I'll change to my dropdown a field here and select use percent and submit that guy. And let me expand that out a little bit. Let me change this window. And hitting submit here, I get to see how much memory is actually being consumed on this box. Here we're hovering about 25% memory consumption. And that is in total use of all of the processes running on the box, right? So how out of the total memory that's allocated to the machine, how much memory is free for new processes or existing processes to consume extra memory. And here we're around 25%. And yeah, just looking, eyeballing off the top of my head, that looks about right. So that looks good. We can also go ahead and configure how frequently we want to schedule this to run. I'll set this to like 5 minutes, for example. We can copy in this kind of message template. We can get an idea of what host memory is running low on memory, and then how much percentage of memory has actually been used. We can set our threshold check. We can actually combine these guys too. So let's say I want to create a warning alert when the total use percent is above 75, and then I can say critical when it's above 90%. Right. So then we'll only get an alert when our memory is within the range. We'll get a warning alert when it's in range 75% to 90%, and then 91 to 100% consumption will be within that critical range. So we can also stack on multiple thresholds within one alert check as well. So I'll go ahead and save that guy off. And then let's go ahead and do a disk space check as well. Disk space, here we can select disk. Just like the memory, we can select the use percentage. If you wanted to only monitor a certain disk on the server, you could do that as well. But by default, it'll just include to monitoring all of them. And here we can see how much disk consumption is used per device on the VM. Our main disk is around about 47%. If I jump back on the server here, the df-a, we see usage. Here we're saying 48%. InfluxDB is giving us 47.6. The operating system just rounds up for you, so we're going to 48. And here you can see the device too, right? This SDA1, which correlates to exactly what we see in our graph. Where my cursor is here, SDA1 is at just over 47% consumption. And then in terms of the check, disk check, we don't have to run this as frequently. So we could set this to like every 6 hours, for example. And then we could copy our message template that we have here, paste that in there. Here, again, we'll get the host, the percentage usage. And then here we're adding another dynamic variable, which will be the device. So like in this case, if the SD1 disk exceeded over whatever percentage that we're about to set there for our threshold, this value here would be SDA1. Let's do similarly to what we did with the memory. So we can stack these as well. So we can say like, I don't know, above 75 and then above, just say 85 for critical. And then set that to OK. Let's actually go ahead and monitor what would be called like a critical service. Now, this could be any critical service or processes that you want to monitor. Our critical ones would be like the Wazoo Indexer service, the Wazoo Manager, Graylog, Grafana, all of those services that are running the various applications that are making up the SIEM stack. We want to make sure we monitor all of those. And instead of a threshold check, we're actually going to do a dead man check. So this is going to check if the service is actually running or not. For here, I'm going to leave it to my Telegraf bucket. I'm going to change my measurement to be a field, and I'm actually going to select active code. And then I'm going to change my drop down from measurement to name. And then here is where I'm going to select the system services that I want to monitor that are running on my Telegraf agents, or on my servers where the Telegraf agent are collecting events from. So here, like for example, you see Fluentbit, right? Which this is the one that's responsible for sending the Wazoo logs to Graylog, right? So that'd be like a good one to monitor. Grafana, of course, and I think those are the only two services that I have running on this guy. I had this Stock Fortress worker provisioning one, which I'll get into that in future videos. That's probably it that I'll include for this. And these service names do reflect what the service name actually is on the box. So if I run like a systemctl status Fluentbit, right? So you can see the service name is fluentbit.service, which correlates to exactly what we see here. I'm running Grafana on this guy, so I could say systemctl status. Here we have Grafana server.service. Again, that correlates exactly what to the name is here. So if there's a service that you want to monitor, just first determine what the actual name of that service actually is, and then you can set this to monitor appropriately. Let me just call this critical services check. For measurement, I'm going to change this again to sub, and I'm going to say running. And if I submit this, you'll see it's just a static line, and the value is going to be 0, telling us that the process is running. So in a sec, once we actually look at our alerts coming through, I'll stop the Grafana service, and then we'll see alerts start to come through InfluxDB. But let's go ahead and actually configure the check. And I'll go ahead and leave this to every minute. I'll change my message template to be just critical service down. And then I'll say when values are not reporting for, let's say, a minute, and then you can stop checking after 15 minutes. Like, so we don't get just spammed with alert after alert after alert, right? While the process is down. So I'll go ahead and save that guy. And now if we go into the alert history, we should see some of these have been running now. So yeah, we see our CPU checks. And of course, the level is coming back to okay because we're not within that threshold range that would generate an alert. We see our memory check. We'll probably see our disk check here in a sec. Oh, sometimes too, I think this is a bug, I guess, within InfluxDB, but sometimes when you do save an alert, it like defaults to name this check still. So you just have to rename it. It's kind of annoying, but yeah, I don't know, is what it is. So I'll just call that to the name that it is, critical process. So I know what this alert configuration is actually monitoring. If I go back to alert history, of course, we're not going to see our disk space check because we've set this to run every 6 hours. So it's going to be a while before this guy runs. We should be able to wait for a minute or so, and then the critical service check will come in, and then I'll go ahead and stop Grafana, and which will trigger an alert. Here, it's actually still defaulting to name this check. Let me just make sure that that's saved. Let me just like resave it maybe, and hopefully that'll be good. But I do see that the status for, okay, it's checking Fluentbit, and it's also checking the Grafana server. These are coming back okay because the service is running. So let me actually stop the Grafana service. If I say stop Grafana server, run the status. So here we see that the service is no longer running. And then once our new check comes in for a minute, right, we'll see that we should see in a level of what would that be, critical, being flagged within our table of alert history. It's probably been about a minute now. So if I hit refresh, and yeah, sure enough, we get a level of critical. We're looking at the check. It's this critical process check. Here we see critical, and here we see the message template starting to take effect, right? So it's naming the service that is down, and then it's actually telling us the host that the service is on. You can, of course, add as many alerts and monitoring of your servers as you'd like. And you can also configure notifications if you like. You can send out to like webhooks, for example, if you want to develop your own application to do something, or send an email message. But in the next video, I'm going to show you guys actually how to integrate InfluxDB with Copilot, so we'll be able to see all of our critical messages directly within Copilot and any of our health check alerts. But before I do that, let me actually go ahead and restart the Grafana server. And once the next time that this guy polls, the level will come back to okay, telling me that the Grafana service is now up and running. In the next video, I'll show you guys how we can integrate Influx with Copilot. And I appreciate you guys' time, and I will see you in the next one.